just a couple of counts. Hello and welcome. We are pleased to present New History at Highland, jointly sponsored by the James Monroe Museum and James Monroe's Highland. I'm Scott Harris, Executive Director of Museums at the University of Mary Washington, and I have the honor of moderating tonight's program. Before we introduce our speakers, there are a few information items and housekeeping details that we would like to do at the very beginning here. We want to thank all of the friends and supporters of both of our museums who mean so much to what we do all the time and who help make programs like this possible. And so thank you very much for that support. We're also grateful for William & Mary's IT department and their technical help, and Jason Woodle, who's the marketing and event manager at Highland, and Lindsay Crawford, the public programs coordinator at the James Monroe Museum, are helping run our boards and keep us straight technologically as well this evening. And we want to thank our colleagues at University of Mary Washington's James Farmer Multicultural Center for helping spread word about tonight's program. We appreciate that support. For more information about how we undertake to talk about the legacies of James Monroe, we invite you to visit highland.org to see how James Monroe's Highland does that, and jamesmonroemuseum.org to see how we do things in Fredericksburg. A few housekeeping details as we're about to get started here. For those of you in the webinar, the Zoom webinar, we think you will have the best experience in the speaker view, which you can access at the upper right of your screen. We will also be taking questions. We'll be gathering those during the presentation and then putting them out for our speakers at the end. If you are in the webinar, you'll use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and enter your questions that way. We'll also be taking them from the Facebook live feed, and we will get as many as our time and our speakers' availability allows. And we appreciate that you will stay on topic and keep them as succinct as possible so that we can get as many as we can. Interpreting the history and the legacy of James Monroe involves looking at a lot of things: his Revolutionary War service, his offices that he held in different levels of government, his diplomatic missions, and his executive leadership, both as governor, as cabinet secretary, and as the 5th president of the United States. But a topic that is getting long overdue attention today is James Monroe's relationship to the institution of slavery, both in his official capacities and in his personal life. And is that latter topic that we will hear from tonight from our speakers. Sara Bon-Harper is Executive Director of James Monroe's Highland, and she is joined by 2 members of Highland's Descendants Advisory Panel, Jennifer Stacy and George Monroe Jr. And Sara, Jennifer, and George, we're extremely happy to have you with us this evening. We're looking forward to your discussion.
Thank you, Scott, and welcome to all of you out there. Many of you, like us, experienced a lot of snow and ice today, and we're glad that we're still to be here with you. A big sigh of relief, and who would have known that even with all the working remote, an ice storm could threaten to shut us down. So we're glad to be here. Yeah, so thank you on behalf of Highland, and let's talk about the history that we're doing, the history that we are collaboratively exploring at Highland, and that we are sharing with various audiences, including those who are visiting our museum. Highland is located in Albemarle County, Virginia, in the central part of the state. I'm advancing my slide here. Let's see. There we go. And Albemarle County outside of Charlottesville is where Highland is located, the home of 5th President James Monroe for a good chunk of his adult life, including many of his elected offices. Right, so the story that we're going to share with you this evening kind of starts with this little house. This small white part of the house here, the white part on the left of the screen was for a long time misinterpreted as a wing of the Monroe main house. And the story went that the house had been partially destroyed by fire, and this little wing was the remnant. Well, our research in recent years changed that, and identified this little standing house as the 1818 guest house, a house built by two enslaved men named Peter and George. And we found this through a combined set of architectural history, archaeology, and dendrochronology, or tree ring dating. So how did that work? We scrutinized the standing house, of course. You can see here from the bird's eye view. And then we also identified the remains of the actual 1799 main house that Monroe and his family moved into in November of that year. It is a set of archaeological remains. The whole house had burned down, not part of it, and really had been forgotten in the intervening generations. And the standing house had been misidentified for, in some cases, over 150 years. So a really significant misunderstanding of that house. And then, as it turns out, that the 1799 house is actually in the front yard of this later Victorian era building, and is a beautifully preserved set of archaeological remains. And when we announced this in 2016 and started really reworking how we understand the site, this is sort of the beginning of the story as we tell it. And so, George, I'll turn to you and let you pick up from there, from the moment of sort of sharing this to the public and where you stepped in and spoke up.
Yeah, sure. So thanks. First off, pleasure being here today, and happy to share our story with you. Interestingly enough, as Sara was realizing the developments of the pre-existing kind of structure of the original presidential house, of course, that made a lot of news, made a lot of local news, some national news, and so I happened to be in Richmond, and by happenstance, we're looking at one of the local articles, I believe, and noticed that there was a feature story about Ashland Highland as we knew it growing up in Charlottesville in Albemarle County. And it was at that point that, I thought it'd be interesting just to go up there, just see what things were about, and to take a look around. And went into the bookstore, and then I met one of the attendants, and I mentioned who I was. I mentioned that my last name was Monroe, and that our oral family history basically states that, our family worked this plantation as enslaved people. And from that point on, we were able to draw a connection, which ultimately led to what I think is a very fruitful work in terms of reinterpreting the history of Highland, understanding the role of the enslaved in that history, then also taking a really hard look at, I think, Monroe as a historical figure and the complexities of the time in which he operated in. Not only as an elected official, as a statesman, but also as a plantation owner, and how that may potentially have conflicted with some of the views that we've heard about over time as it relates to its actual happenings in history. So if we go down to the next slide, this, as I was saying before, we were able to partner with Highland to kick off a number of things. One is looking at, again, the history and focusing in on, okay, so how do we actually draw connections with other groups that are doing similar work? As you see on the slide here, the Uva Bicentennial event was really an opportunity for us as descendants to also meet with other descendants locally that came from sites such as, the University of Virginia, Monticello, and in some cases here, there were folks that were also a part of the Montpelier plantation. And so with that kind of opportunity came, I would call, a great responsibility in terms of getting history right. If you think about the situations that have surrounded Charlottesville in recent years, this time in terms of really understanding history, having it as an input into broader conversations about race relations and social equity as it relates to the country are now even more vitally important. And so Sara and I had an opportunity, going to the next slide, had an opportunity to participate in an initiative that has wide-ranging impacts for the nation in terms of, the emergence of descendant communities and other public spaces where, history is at the forefront, and in particular, the history of the enslaved and its relationship to some of these different sites across the U.S. Engaging descendant communities was something that was sponsored by the National Summit and I believe it was the Southern Poverty Law Center and the National Trust for Historic Preservation, where we had an opportunity to sit down with other professionals in the field. You had educators, you had folks that were also in different museums that were coming to talk about, how do you tell slavery and the story of slavery in its proper context? And then how do you set a standard for other museums and public spaces to consider as they started to go down their own journey and embarking on telling the same story? And so out of this effort came a rubric where someone who are just starting out with kind of telling the story can say, okay, these are step level improvements that we can make from as far as introducing the conversation all the way to being world class in terms of having an opportunity to engage, inform descendant communities and advisory boards, approach the whole concept of shared authority, identify different areas of research. These things are all vitally important because they're going to really drive what I refer to as, again, the national conversation on race relations. So if we go to the next slide here, as a result of this work, we've been able to be featured quite a bit. The descendant community has had an opportunity to be featured in the New York Times. We've had, NPR, as you can see here. We've been recognized internationally by the Le Monde paper out of Paris, France. And so, I really believe this is only the beginning in terms of, our ability to not only uncover what's going on in Highland, but become a beacon for other areas and other groups that are looking to do the same thing, especially as it relates to, really helping museums and museums of such really focus on telling the right story, the proper story, as it relates to history with primary source information and the inclusion of oral family histories that will be very prominent coming from descendant communities. So thanks.
Sorry for the delay. Hi, I'm Jennifer, and I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for inviting us. And I pick up with George talked about just more engagement with different media outlets, and the New York Times is one of them. And they kind of picked up the story after hearing about some important research done by Martin Violet and Miranda Burnett, and where they actually did some extensive history looking at five families that were sold to Joseph Mills White in Casabianca, and that was located in Monticello, Florida. And I want to backtrack just for a minute. Martin visited our church in Middle Oak, and in this picture, my mother's in this picture beside George, and there's an event there that's called Homecoming, where all the families come back together on this in a particular, the second Sunday in August, and Martin showed up there and met our family for the first time, and established a relationship and kind of shared some of the research that he was doing. And then out of that research that they were doing came this article by Audra Birch, and it was just talking more about the how they did the research, found the families in Casabianca, and had the opportunity to connect with some of the descendants in Florida and establish some relationships there with that descendant community. And thankfully, out of that, we were able to connect with one of the descendants, and they are now a member of our council. And I want to kind of stop and kind of share what that was like, just kind of meeting Joyce for the first time. She's on our council, and we had been meeting regularly and getting to know, we didn't have to get to know each other. We're the members of our council, they're primarily family, and then people that we've known mostly our entire lives. And but to meet Joyce and to meet one of the descendants from family there at Highland, during the time there before they were sold to, I highly doubt most Indian slave I highly doubt there are a lot of enslaved communities or descendants that can say they've had the opportunity to reconnect with families who were sold from, from a plantation. And I'm sure the stories exist for others, but I don't think I've heard a lot. And to be there in that moment when we got to meet her, it was just surreal. It was powerful. I don't really have words for it. And so we're ever thankful for the research that was done to bring that part of the Highland descendant community together. And I think that, out of that research also, I think during the times that we meet on the council, and I think we can go to the next slide. I'm a little all over the place, so I apologize for that. But the council is made up of, like I said, a lot of my family members, and then we have some of the other descendants from Spotswood Jones family, and then we have Joyce, who represents Casabianca Plantation, and the importance of being able to share authority there at Highland. I can't even speak enough about it. I remember when we first started meeting, I remember driving my mom up to Highland and hearing her say, I just really wonder what our ancestors were thinking when they were here, working on this plantation, and what was going through their minds. It was pretty much the first time my mom ever started to really share those types of thoughts. Also was the first time I think, we did an oral history there as a part of the work that we're doing. And it was the first time that I heard my mom talk about Jim Crow. And that was an extremely powerful moment for me to hear my mother talk for the first time. She's 80 and I'm 57. And to hear her talk for the first time about what it was like to live through Jim Crow, it was, I don't think that if we had not been working with Highland on this project, I don't think that my mom would ever have really shared those thoughts. And so that's just an example of the importance of the work that's being done, not only for the sake of history, but also for the sake of reconciliation and also processing. And the shared authority that continues. We now have, I think a couple of things that we talked about was we were very concerned about the next generation and being able to have participation from the next generation. And we now have 2 members of the next generation who have joined our council, and they are participating. And we were a little concerned about it because, there are times that I think people don't really have those conversations with the next generation, and realizing the importance of keeping this going was very important for the council. And so we're happy to have their participation now. Please go to the next slide. I'm sorry. We have been able to participate in presentations. This is a picture of my cousin Watine, my cousin George, and my mom, actually in a presentation to the teachers in the community. And if you'd asked me if my mom would ever be in front of anyone presenting anything, I would say, I don't think so. But she loved the presentation. Cousin Watine loved the presentation. It was pretty powerful. I wasn't able to participate, but I can tell you that the positive feedback that came from both family members who participated, and from, I think, feedback that Sara reported from teachers, it ends up being a very powerful opportunity to share some of the, some of our personal stories, some of our personal reflections, and certainly an opportunity for the community at large to learn about descendant communities and the importance of the shared authority now. I think I probably talked way too much. So I think that it's probably time to hand off for the next slide for Sara.
Jennifer, thank you, and George too. I think that whatever you have to say on all of these topics is the most important part of the conversation. So we're good. So where does this intersect with what we do in the public? That's where I'm going to turn this right now. You've seen a little bit about the real meaning of it in terms of what George hopes in the national conversation. Jennifer's talking about on the very personal and family level. And I think these are really about history and the importance of history in understanding the present and in being transmitted to current generations and being able to impact a different future. So, you know, returning to the idea that we are reinterpreting the historic site, you know, I'm emphasizing this little standing house, the 1818 presidential guest house. It for years, having been misunderstood, was curated or made exhibits of in the way as if it were a wing of the Monroe main residence. And so with all of the input, including of descendant advisors, we have made a new interpretive plan for the site. And what we are working on right now is a new way of visiting Highland and a new way of understanding the site. And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of those changes and talk a bit about what I hope are the important themes and approaches to history here. I see that my internet is unstable. I hope we're all still together. All right, so COVID has changed a lot. And I think it has changed the way we understand going through interior spaces like these confined historic spaces with a guide who imparts knowledge through speaking. And so in other parts of our museum, we have self-guided exhibits with interpretive panels, and you see examples of these here. And then in the 1818 guest house, we will have similar exhibits and interpretive through on their own, at their own speed, and to stay with their small groups and really limit the amount of inside time they have with others and the amount of spoken interpretation going on from a member of guide staff to the public. And so, you know, COVID will go away and we will come out the other side, but we think that this way of learning is going to be an important step, not just for this period that we're all going through now, but also coming out the other side, we will keep that mode of learning. So we're in the process of making it. It will probably be done at about the time that we're all thankfully getting vaccinated, but we're going to keep that self-guided and learning on one's own method. So the interior spaces that have been interpreted as the main house for so long will be changed, and they will be historic rooms. They will be historic bedrooms as they would have been, guest chambers. And this current dining room, for example, will be a guest house room in preparation for visitors. You'll see the activity going on of opening and closing a house. You will see the intersection of actors, that is of historic individuals with life on the plantation. So people coming from elsewhere, including Washington, and interacting with people who are living at historic Highland and what their own experiences were. And by this interaction, we hope to reflect on what is going on in this larger circle of the political and economic world, and see how those events are reflected on this kind of stage or this part of the world that is Highland. So people who are involved in politics or the agricultural world, which is part of economics, these will all sort of intersect here in this space with the idea of people coming from elsewhere to be at Highland, and then people being at Highland full time engaged also in political and economic activities such as agriculture. So that's how this room will be changed. Oops, I did that too fast. And then the other guest chamber will also be a historic room that has that reflects who was visiting, talks about Monroe's political circle, and also the lives of enslaved people who are working in and preparing those spaces. The other rooms, all of which were added after the original 1818 guest house, will be exhibits. So not period rooms, there'll be exhibits or vignettes, that is little scenes set up to talk about certain actions and certain events and people. So they will be curated not as original rooms, but as other spaces. And so let's talk for a minute about the themes and the way we hope to approach history. This is a still image from our AR, or augmented reality, that we had been running for a couple of years before COVID shut down. And it shows an enslaved spinner who is working wool, because that was one of the products of the plantation. This spinner, when another enslaved individual whose name is Hannah enters, that they then embark on a conversation. And the conversation wanders to cotton and cotton production in the Deep South, and what it meant for not just what these people were doing, they're working wool, but it also then connected them to the larger economic and political world of the growth in the cotton plantation. So in the Deep South, of course, the Piedmont of Virginia is not cotton growing, but the growth in economics was about cotton at the time. And so that really was a threat, a looming threat for enslaved families who risked being sold away from their homes and their loved ones, and sold to the very hungry cotton industry in the Deep South. Now, all of this intersects with Monroe's political and geopolitical world, with the United States expansion and the opening up of new farming territories, as well as issues. Yeah, so let's just leave that there. I don't want to go too long on that, but the intersection with the political world of very much individual lives of enslaved people whose names we know, people whose lives we understand to a certain extent is a really important theme of these exhibits, in my opinion, so that we understand the historical role of these individuals, just like we talk about Monroe's historical role, the role he played, for example, in the Missouri crisis. And then we can see how that played out for lots of other people, including enslaved people. So that connection with from that individual perspective to the historical via economics and politics is what's really important to me. So using events, using the stories of people's lives and families to connect to history, that's the really critical piece. And it really comes home with the stories of enslaved people from Highland. And Jennifer's already introduced this with the idea that several families of enslaved people were sold from Highland to the Casa Bianca plantation of Colonel Joseph White in Florida. And that's where the work of Violet and Burnett comes in and identifies descendants and so forth. But to really then recognize this this growth in the United States, what impact that has on enslaved people in the Upper South, and making enslaved individuals the primary export of the state of Virginia at that time, and the very real threat that has for individual lives and family lives at places much like Highland, including Highland. So we will be interpreting all of these themes and events and people's stories in the guest house first, in some outside spaces, and we will be over the course of several years, continuing to create new exhibits, continuing to excavate this site of the 1799 main house, because there's certainly a lot more to be known. Yeah, so I guess we can turn here, Jennifer and George, to what do we want to say next? We're trying to create a new experience for people, a new way of learning about history, and we've titled this talk New Histories. Where do we want to go from here? What tell me a little bit more about, where you both queued up very well, Jennifer, with the family stories and with family meaning, and then George with the idea of we can really enter a conversation on race relations. I'd like to turn it over to go next on this.
I know I was thinking that, the discovering the true house is kind of a symbol of authenticity. It's like it's the start of the truth, the real truth, and that includes hearing about the descendant community. And for me, I think it goes hand in hand, and that and it's about getting it right to the best of our ability. I mean, we're not there. But we definitely have like oral history that I think has not been shared enough in society, and that it's time to open those conversations up so that there is a clear understanding of the contribution. And I can't even, the contribution is it's not a strong enough word for me personally, I guess. And that it's a sacrifice, and it's an incredible, I think that what sitting here listening to Sara say people were the primary export during that time is a pretty powerful statement to just kind of sit with. And I think it's time that we all just sat with that as a, and felt that. And I think that this shared authority and getting the story right will help people truly connect with that and not just kind of skirt over it. Yeah, it was slavery. No, people were being exported. And so this is an opportunity to, to connect the emotions with the history, I think, and also under a better understanding of the experiences and the inclusion of the descendant communities' history and stories that have been passed down. That helps us all connect and really understand more in detail about the true history.
Yeah, so I call it the Great Contradiction, right? Because you think about the forefathers of the United States, and you think about the fact that the nation was kind of birthed around this kind of concept that all men were born and created equal, right? But the whole concept of race and slavery was a can that's been kicked down through the history of this country, and even now in 2021. There's still open and honest conversations that need to be had about the fair and desired equitable treatment of African Americans and other people of color, right? And so here, what I see as Highland, from a national conversation standpoint, is the fact that here we have a founding father, a president, and we have an opportunity to really take a look at his mindset, his opinions on things. The contradiction that I always kind of toil about is the fact that Monroe, he did set up Liberia for free African Americans who chose to go back to Africa, but yet he still maintained slavery, at least 250 of such. To me, that's a great contradiction. But so it's kind of like when you get to the idea of the fact that the great commodity was the selling of whole people. But yet when you read about Monroe and you read about Jefferson, and you say, well, their preference was to keep, enslaved peoples and groups and families. That was actually a blessing for us because, our family farmed 7 miles, 11 miles from Highland. We can basically look back at our history and go all the way back to 1780. And now, one part I can say, well, thank you for having for that idea because our family remained intact, right? But if you look at chattel slavery, across the South, right? The selling of humans, the breaking up of families was a harsh reality. So that you would have a cousin who might have got sold deep south, or a mother or a father or a brother, but we were privileged to have our family remain intact as far as we know. So I think that, there's still a whole lot of work to do in terms of this kind of case study of that is Monroe. And then I think about the more recent events of Charlottesville as far as August 12th and, the rise of, well, not the, I won't even call it the rise of white supremacy. I would call it white supremacy showing its face after being dormant for a while, right? Events taking place in Charlottesville, how we have an awesome opportunity to kind of not only tell the story of what happened at Highland, but use it as a backdrop to how, those conversations of, enslaved people and communities at Highland and in other kind of wealthy, well-to-do Virginia plantations set the backdrop of white supremacy that exists in Charlottesville today, right? So if we have an opportunity to uncover history, uncover economic impacts, uncover generational impacts in terms of, the harsh legacy of slavery, then it's going to help influence worldviews of those who say, well, just get past it and move on, right? It's not enough to say that. There's a responsibility that we have now to tackle the hard truths, with integrity, and then say, okay, based upon these things that we've identified, what do we now need to do differently to make sure that there's a fair and equitable playing field for everyone to realize that full reality of all men being created equally and of course, being endowed with certain rights. Kind of got heavy there, but I'll turn it back to you.
No, I think this conversation is heavy. It's meant to be heavy, but I think, the other thing that you mentioned the contradiction. It's and complexity of slavery. I mean, and the founding fathers. There's a lot there, and if we look at it as a dialogue and an ongoing dialogue rather than this place where we're talking at and past each other instead of having an open dialogue and understanding more about the complexities. I think that's at the root of our goals and objectives. I mean, the goal and objective of shared authority and getting it right is so that we are able to sit down and have these complex discussions about race. Because if we don't, I don't see any hope for us to have racial equity. I don't. I mean, and how long can we keep going, skirting over things and not really getting into the deeper parts and pieces? I think it's important.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because when I think about the role of museums, right, and the demographics of those that attend these museums, that right there at the forefront is an opportunity to start getting the story right. We have these networks, these vast networks of museums who are telling history from a certain perspective. And so, like I had mentioned before, as far as the work with the National Trust, there is now a framework that exists to really think about, okay, so how do we tell the proper story from the right perspective that's inclusive and not just one-sided. There was a question that just came through the chat room as far as defining racial equity. I mean, equity, and when you think about equity, you're talking about equality, right? So if you don't understand, for example, things like unequal access to societal resources such as jobs, housing, you know, monetary means. These are things that can actually start to, if you look back at history, you can start to tell the story of how we got to the place that we are, right? So when you think about the role of museums in this particular space, you know, these are your opportunities to tell history, to tell point in time history that will influence how we think about things today, right? And so again, getting it right, really targeting, some of the hard truths as I've mentioned before. I see a really critical space, not only just for Highland, but for other museums as well.
I think, thinking about racial equity, I think one of the biggest pieces is education. I mean, it's just, when you think about, Jim Crow laws, when you think about slaves not being able in the South to be educated for hundreds of years, the impact, I can't even overstate it. The impact is just, you can't make up for that in a few decades. You just cannot. And so what you can do is you can work hard to try, but I can't even begin to tell you that the impact is enormous. And that's a starting, for me, that's a starting place for racial equity. It's just, just education is something no one can take away from you. And it's something that is critical to us as a people getting, moving and progressing. So
can I, and thank you, both of you, for this. I think every time we talk about this, I learn more and feel more. And so thank you. And thank you for doing it in this context. I guess I want to say two things. One is to first embrace what you're saying here, Jennifer, and talk about education, as a form of truth telling. That idea of truth telling is one of the first ways that we approach the injustices of the past, is by being honest about what happened. One of the ways we do that in the new exhibits, for example, is to include stories of slavery and enslaved individuals, both sort of the institution of slavery and then individuals and families, in all aspects of the new exhibits. So there's not like a separate part about slavery. There is American history, and slavery is a part of that. And so that's kind of one of those ways that I'm guiding us to be what I hope is a set of good educators in talking about how slavery was such an essential part of how the United States came to be and how it is. So I think maybe it would be useful just briefly to introduce the concept that we've been talking about without really defining, which is shared authority. And George actually talked about the whole genesis of this idea, where he and I were fortunate to be at the Montpelier National Trust several days of really thinking about how to truthfully talk about slavery. And the idea of shared authority means that museum professionals like myself, who so often come from outside the communities, who are so heavily and negatively impacted by the history, we should have counsel, and we should share the authority of telling the history, telling the stories, the research, the interpretation, and the really the relationship about it. And so that's what shared authority is, the idea that I may bring some of the museum skills, but the decision making and the the sort of choosing the tone, choosing some of the narratives, choosing, maybe tweaking a little bit, changing according to your suggestions. That's what shared authority means here in this context. And certainly may evolve as we continue this relationship into other parts of our work. But in terms of these exhibits, that's what that means. And in terms of really the idea of whose history is it, right? It doesn't belong to me. I am privileged to have a role in discovering it and sharing it, but it is not my history.
I think we have several questions that started coming through,
Okay.
whether we want to field those or not.
Why, yes, we do. And as your smiling moderator, I'm coming back in to try and navigate some of those for y'all. And we do invite folks to keep coming with them. Doing a little bit of combining here just to try and keep things focused. We had a question that was several parts about the size of the property, how many enslaved people were at Highland, and what caused the sale of these families. And I would roll in a related question about, were enslaved people sold annually or gradually, or were there seminal events that led to larger sales? So I think generally, what were the forces and the processes that characterized Highland's enslaved population, and what would lead to some of the sales?
So shall I take that? How's that sound, friends? Is that good? Right. So there was a lot of parts in that. So Scott can keep me honest if I missed some. From the work of others, I have counted 250 individuals enslaved by Monroe during his lifetime. At Highland, the number varied because Monroe owned multiple properties at any given time. And there, certainly the most prominent other property is Oak Hill in Loudoun County, Virginia. And certainly enslaved people went back and forth between those properties in particular. That wasn't the only other property Monroe owned. And we know, for example, from one particular census that there were 49 adult men and women at Highland. So one can imagine also children, that is below age 16. That's sort of a harsh reckoning of calling an adult, but so that's that. The property that William and Mary now owns is 535 acres. Monroe purchased 1,000 originally and grew the population to about 3,500 acres eventually. I'm going to zoom out just for a second because I am constitutionally, that is my own personal constitution, driven to do this, to say that let's contextualize this. Monroe was cash strapped a lot. And a lot of these men they worked on a credit economy and so forth. But to contextualize that, it's because these tobacco and mixed grain plantations in the Upper South by the teens and 1820s were not really the center of the economy. As I've said, the center of the economy was in the new areas, the cotton growing areas of the Deep South in particular, which are relevant to this conversation. And so there were market forces that were also contributing to Monroe's being cash strapped. It wasn't just, the old story goes about, he had a string of incompetent overseers. He did have a string of overseers and he was never happy with them, but we have to zoom out and look at the larger historical context. And this is that piece that I hammer on, that we have to do that historical context. So he was often at a loss, for profit. And he tended to sell enslaved people primarily when he needed money. And this is one of those pieces of history that also is very poignant and brings home the real essence. So we see a lot of times in Monroe's writing, especially before his uncle Joseph Jones died, there would often be sort of expressions of almost attachment to enslaved individuals, sort of very kind remarks and so forth. But really, ultimately, it was about economics. And that's where the very harsh reality comes in. So it was economic need that inspired sale. So I guess that's that very hard answer to that question. And again, to contextualize, that's when, you know, Richmond was a major center for the domestic slave trade. And Monroe was not alone in the Upper South here as having more labor than the economy could support. And that meant individual lives and families that were dispersed. Did I answer all the pieces, Scott?
I believe you did, yes. You get an A.
I'm glad for that.
There are a couple of questions from folks who have some previous experience with Highland that are getting a bit into the decisions and the mechanics of the interpretive approach. And I'm going to try to synthesize those into something that hopefully will be easy to respond to. One was a question about the 1818 house and how that is going to be used in helping tell the fuller story. And the person asking the question had some interpretive background working at Highland in the past. And kind of a related, actually, is it from the same person? No, different person. Related question about explaining some of the rationale for moving away from interpretive guides to focus on more of a self-guided experience, and how that, in y'all's view, I guess, helps support the way you're telling the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Let me see if I can sort of get through both of those with one through line. So first to move away from live interpretive guides telling the story, right? There is a need for that immediately, right? We are in no position now in our world to go through small historic enclosed spaces with groups of strangers, with 15 or 17 strangers. That is just so far from what we can imagine. Hopefully we will have our new exhibits done before the end of COVID. But nonetheless, I think our awareness and our inclination to be in enclosed spaces with strangers is going to change. I think we are now at a point when a lot of visitors, especially younger visitors, are interested in sort of choosing their own experience to a certain extent, being their own curator, to read through, to dive down in areas that are most interesting, to maybe glance over other areas. And so I'm really trying to respond to the idea of creating experiences for different audiences, age-wise, as well as other factors, in moving from a guided tour to interpretive panels. Now, we're never going to completely go away from, you may be relieved to hear, from our knowledgeable staff who are on site and who will discuss either in guided tours in other parts of our property or in our drop-in stations that have worked so well for that one-on-one or small group discussion at will. So those are never going to go away. And I think that's a good thing, because really being able to discuss these concepts is important. And I think that we can really take advantage of the fact that we are a smaller site. Our guide staff are almost always available to have conversations saying, you know, what do you want to know more about? And yes, I'd like to answer that question. And so was the other question, how are we going to tell the story of slavery in the guest house? Was that it?
It was you sort of did the second part of it more, and then there was a specific reference to the 1818 house.
Yeah, and so when I went through, for example, so a little bit of the interpretive plan and talked about reinterpreting, say, the dining room to be a room that is in preparation for guests' visits. That is part of that 1818 guest house, where the two main rooms, the two original rooms, are going to be period rooms and reflect the guest house use of the property. And then the North Shed edition will be exhibit spaces, and the 1850s room will be vignettes that really feature some of the very rich historical artifacts, a lot of which come from the James Monroe Museum. I'll give y'all a plug there. And so we will, the material culture that comes from Monroe's family. Yeah.
I'm going to exercise moderator's prerogative and ask my own question for Jennifer and for George first, although really for Sara too. And you've alluded to it a little bit, but I wanted to go a little deeper. do you feel that the process that you've gone through and are going through with this sort of journey of discovery has changed you individually and personally? And if so, how? Jennifer, perhaps you first, and George, and Sarah, all of you.
Definitely has changed. I think I kind of talked about it, just the opportunity to kind of hear more from my mother, and that's the connect. That's it for me. That's the powerful piece that has opened up. It opened up a part of her that I hadn't seen, and so it's and conversations in our family amongst me and my sisters. They have just, there are moments we're on the phone, we're just chatting about regular family things, and then all of a sudden we'll talk about something. Oh, something that happened with my grandparents, or whatever. And just the sharing of our oral history, and being able to reflect back and be connected on a deeper level. And I won't go any more than that. I'll let George answer, because I know we're getting close to time. But
Yeah, I would say the main thing for me is empowerment. When I first started kind of the genealogical journey, it was really about understanding what makes me tick, and I use that term a lot. And now I have a pretty good understanding after the last 3 to 4 years about what makes me tick. I've learned a lot about my family. I've learned a lot about our makeup, emotional makeup, physical makeup, fortitude even. And so I've learned a lot about, who we are as a person, who we are as a people, and who I am as a person. And, so I feel pretty good about where we're going from there.
And Sarah, what's it meant to you?
Well, I'll, for just one moment, also give a personal answer, which is that I think I've learned a lot, especially from Jennifer and George, about generosity. There are so many times when, in discussing this history and discussing the present, that Jennifer and George, you in particular, have every right to be angry or express anger at the inequities that we still live based on the legacies of slavery. There is no reason why you are compelled to be so generous with your instruction and with your education of me as well as others, and your willingness to step forward and teach. So I'll probably enough said on that, but I think learning about generosity, learning that example has been the most meaningful to me.
I cannot let us end without asking at least one other question because of the source. I will simply say a former Bowley scholar at the James Monroe Museum, who is now a curator at a presidential site. And so we're very happy that she's tuned in, and she asked more of a professional question in a way, but it has a lot to do with how to confront the subjects and the approaches that y'all have confronted. Do any of you have suggestions for sites that are interested in building similar descendant advisory councils, but don't have necessarily the relationships that y'all were able to tap, or even names? I mean, where are good places to start if you realize that you want to make this sort of outreach, but you don't have necessarily those immediate contacts that y'all were able to capitalize?
I think I can take a stab at it. I think looking back, well, before I start, I'll say, number one, thank you, Sarah, for that. That meant a lot. So the way I would answer that question is coming from the standpoint of integrity, right? Even if you don't have a descendant community to reach out to first, right? I think that you have to approach truth telling with integrity and not be afraid to tackle the hard discussions. I think number one. Second piece is, with anything, the importance of primary and secondary sources, and telling history within its entirety is another big thing that I think that is also important. And I think that when you get to a point where you identify, a descendant community that you want to basically engage, I think you need to be authentic. And Sara has been very much authentic with us. She's been real. She's been, we have this saying in our family, real recognizes real. So, anytime we, engage with folks, we might be talking with you, but we're looking at you. And when I say we're looking at you, we're looking for a kink, meaning, is there any way that this person could be blowing us smoke, right? We never saw that with Sara. She was authentic. She was genuine. And then I think she approached this whole thing with integrity. And so I think that's a backdrop as a lesson for other museums, approach these things with sensitivity, with integrity, and be genuine. And I think that when you start to engage folks like myself and my cousin Jennifer, what you'll find is the background, the foundation of a quality relationship. And I'll stop there.
No, I agree. I 100% agree with what you said. It is really about building the relationship and the trust. And if the trust isn't there, I can't imagine it being successful for long. And I will just say that I say this, I share this a lot. My cousins were not immediately on board, especially the male cousins. My mom loves to talk. She loves to meet new people. She loves new experiences. She's on board. But the male cousins were very standoffish. They were very skeptical. And it was the truth that I think the transparency, the genuineness, and the desire to the being real. It wasn't a desire. It was finding Sara to be real, to be a woman of her word, and to be, very direct and straightforward about the approach. And I think that, the relationships have been built, and they're still growing. They're still growing. Experiences are still happening as we go through this process. And that's just an important foundational part of this. So absolutely, George.
Well, we have reached just about our limit, maybe slightly over, but I don't think anyone is going to have a problem with that. I do have one final question to pose to y'all, and you can go in whatever order you like, but it is this. What would you most like people to learn from the work that you are doing, that you will be doing going forward? Why don't we go George, Jennifer, and then Sara?
Wow. So whoever came up with that question, that they get the gold star for tonight, because that one is causing me to scratch my head a little bit. I think the biggest thing to get out of this is that history is not one side, and history is complex. History is nuanced. It's not going to always be the bright and shiny, beautiful thing that's out there. And I think that a lot of times the approach to history in this country has always been to show the kind of this is a tough question, but I think that the approach to history in this country has always been very white. And I think that now with the emergence of some of these critical things that are going on in society, it's high time to recognize other contributions to the development of this country. And that's going to be important in terms of advancing the future conversation of race relations. The other thing too is that along with that, there's going to be a responsibility. There's going to be a call to action for those who may have had a certain view. You're going to get challenged when history starts to reveal itself. And once you get challenged with things that you might have, when you get challenged with new truths that might be different than what you might have heard coming through your family or what society might have told you, you're going to have a courage to actually change. Because then at that particular point, there's no excuse to hang on to certain things that you've held on to because it becomes a comfort blanket to you. And when I say you, I'm talking in general terms, right? So the first thing is history is not always one-sided. We want to tell a complete history. Secondly, I personally want to challenge worldviews. I want to challenge worldviews about me as a person, my community as African Americans and our contributions to this country. And I want to challenge the concept of race, right? And challenge the concept of diversity, because I think that once you get and you start to peel back layers, you're going to find that we're more alike than we are different. And so the term diversity can no longer be kicked down the road, right? So those three things: true history telling, tackling matters of consciousness, and then let's blow this thing about diversity up. Let's celebrate it. Let's also find where we actually have common ground.
I think for me, I think George said it well. I think just understanding that our founding fathers, they were complex. I mean, they were flawed and they were human beings. And if we look at it from that perspective, I think it makes it a little easier for us to explore the history, the incredible, horrible ugliness of slavery, and understand that, and better open our minds to be in the place, to hear the stories, to reflect on them and put them in perspective, rather than to just take the approach to shut it out because, okay, he had slaves, I'm done. That's not the place we want to come from. I think that open, sustained dialogue is the most important thing that we can do for each other in order to better understand and get to the racial equity that we've been talking about. I think that an important piece of that is being in the room. And certainly for Black people, being in the room. We could, if we're not in the room, you don't know our perspective. And there are a lot of times that I think a lot of people take for granted that that everybody's opinion is being considered, everybody's history is being considered, everybody's perspective. That's not always true. So to have the opportunity to be in the room and to talk, to share our experiences, our family's experience, history, to have the shared authority, it's being in the room and being heard, and that's incredibly powerful for not only for us in this moment, but for the future as well. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. It's hard to follow those two statements. But first, let me also say thank you, not just, which I think we all feel, Jennifer and George, for being here tonight, but also for your really kind words and for what underlies that, which is your trust in our relationships. So thank you. I think what I want to convey is this sense that the events and lives of Highland, and even going forward in history, we've talked a bit about all the decades since slavery ended, that these events and lives are part of history, right? So to connect them with the larger stories which help us to understand who we are as a people now, that's really important to me. And then to include slavery writ large and the individual stories of enslaved people and families as part of that, essentially part of that story, not as a separate history. So those two pieces are what I'm working for and what I'm hoping that in the applied work that we're doing, that we can accomplish.
George Monroe Jr., Jennifer Stacy, Sara Bon-Harper, thank you. I think by your presence in this forum tonight, by the work you've been doing, to use Jennifer's phrase, you have brought your ancestors into the room. You've brought them into the conversation in a way that they were not in their lives, but hopefully they will be now and in the future because of what you're all doing. And it's a great pride that we have to be taking a small part in helping share that through this program with y'all tonight. So thank you. Thanks to everyone who has watched. Reminder again, highland.org, jamesmonroemuseum.org, and you'll be able to see the archived version of this program online soon. Thank you all and good evening.
Thank you.